Hey everybody, it's Rob here from Trinity Streetsville, and here at Trinity, we're just a group of ordinary people learning to follow Jesus in our day. If you were going to tell the greatest story ever, the Christmas story, where would you begin? I don't know, but the gospel writer Matthew, he starts off by giving us just a long list of some pretty boring names. But when you dig a little deeper, you'll find out that in that list of names is the heart of Christmas itself. Stick around and I'll explain it all to you in a moment. One of the things that we often take for granted is that we don't have one or two or three, but we actually have four different accounts of Jesus' life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in many ways, these accounts are very similar, but in other ways, they're actually very different. And Christmas is one of the ways in which these stories are very different. For example, I don't know if you knew this, but in Mark's gospel and in John's gospel, there's actually nothing said at all about Jesus as a child or being born or the Christmas story. It's just not there. Those stories begin when Jesus is like 30 years old and he's beginning his ministry. In Luke's gospel, there is definitely a story. The Christmas story is told, although it should be noted that Luke actually begins his gospel telling the story not of the birth of Jesus, but the birth of John the Baptist. And then we come to the gospel of Matthew. Now, Matthew is very interesting, very unique, because he doesn't start his story or his Christmas story even with a story at all. He starts instead with a long list of names. It's a family tree, if you will. And if you were to say, let's say you're one of those people and you're like, you know what, I've decided I am going to read the Bible. I'm going to read the New Testament. You sit down and you turn to the beginning of the New Testament, Matthew 1:1, and you start reading. The first few verses are going to turn you right off. You'll be like, what is this? It's just a whole lot of names, hard to pronounce names of people. I don't even know who half these people are, and you may put it down and never pick it up again. But last Sunday, we actually asked you guys to try your very best to read through these 17 verses of names found in Matthew 1:1, and here's how you did. So we're seeing how well our Trinity members do when it comes to reading through the genealogy of Jesus. You ready to go, Crystal?
Yes.
All right, give it a go.
Okay, we have Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers.
Judah was the father of Perez, Zerah, whose mother was Tamar.
Perez, the father of Hezron, Hezron, the father of Ram.
Ram, the father of Amminadab, Amminadab, the father of Nahshon.
Nahshon, the father of Salmon, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab.
Boaz was the father of Obed, who was the mother of Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David.
David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife.
Solomon, the father of Rehoboam.
Rehoboam, the father of Abijah. Abijah, the father of Asa.
Asa, the father of Jehoshaphat.
Jehoshaphat, the father of Jehoram.
Jehoram, the father of Uzziah. Now you do this.
Oh, I haven't got a clue. I can tell you it's the father of somebody's.
Isaiah, father of Jotham.
Jotham, the father of Asa, Asa, the father of Hezekiah.
Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh, Manasseh, the father of Ammon.
Amon, the father of Josiah.
And Josiah, the father of Jeconiah, his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel.
Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, the father of
Abihud.
Abihud, the father of Eliakim. Eliakim, the father of Azor.
Azor, the father of Zadok. Zadok, the father of Akim.
Akim, the father of Elihud. Elihud, the father of Eliezer.
Elazar was the father of Mathan. Mathan was the father of Jacob.
And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary.
And Mary was the mother of Jesus Christ, who is called the Messiah. Praise God. Merry Christmas.
Praise God. Merry Christmas. What a way to start the Christmas story. And anyways, over the next few weeks of Advent, we are going to be looking at this family tree of Jesus as a way of getting ready for Christmas. And today I want to start by talking about what Matthew included in his genealogy, or who Matthew included in his genealogy. I've given you these little sermon notes so you can follow along, maybe learn something this morning. Here's how the family tree begins, and we're not going to read it all through this morning, but it begins this way. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, that's important, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Isn't this fascinating? You know, some people are fascinated with this stuff. Most of us are not fascinated with this. So why did Matthew decide, oh, this is the way to start the Christmas story. This is the way to start the story of Jesus? Well, you have to understand a couple things. One, you have to understand that Matthew was writing to a primarily Jewish audience. And two, he was writing to communicate something very important. He was writing to communicate that Jesus was connected to David. Because here's one of the very first questions that any Jewish person is going to ask if Matthew's trying to make the case that Jesus is the Son of God and Jesus is the Messiah and Jesus is the anointed one, he's the promised Messiah. They're going to say, wait, don't say another word, Matthew, until you have proved to me that he is connected in his lineage to David. Because the Bible tells us that it will be a descendant of David that will sit on the throne, that the Messiah will be descended from King David. And now, because Matthew knew that this is where his audience was going to be coming from, he starts the story, the big story, Matthew's gospel. He starts by answering this very big question about who Jesus is ultimately related to. So that's kind of why he starts this way. But Matthew does something really, really strange in all of this. In his genealogy, he includes a bunch of people that you would actually expect him to leave out. First, he includes women. That alone is strange. Most genealogies around that time trace the genealogies through the men. It was a patriarchal culture. Women weren't mentioned. But not only does Matthew mention women, 4 women in particular, but he chooses to mention 4 who have the most, shall we say, kind of questionable character or history that goes with them. And along with those 4 women, he mentions about a bunch of other kind of questionable characters as well, all of whom you would definitely leave out if your goal was trying to prove that Jesus was from divine and holy lineage. Because you see, here's how it worked in ancient times. In ancient times, history was written by paid historians. So if you were a ruler or a king or a governor, and you wanted to write some history of your reign, what you would do is you would hire someone, and you would get that person, and you'd say, sit down and write my history. But of course, I want you to make me look as good as possible in this history. And that's what the historian would do. The historian would sit down, and they would say, well, listen, let's talk all about all your amazing military victories, but when it comes to your military defeats, you know what, we won't include that bit. Or let's talk about all your fantastic children who went on to do great and wonderful things, but as for those other children who were kind of ne'er-do-wells or, you know, didn't amount to much or actually did some pretty horrible things, we're going to leave them out of the genealogy altogether. And that is why when you read ancient history sometimes, not that I'm a pro at this, but I've heard that there are huge gaps sometimes in ancient histories, because this is exactly what's happened. The historians have pulled out the stuff that the person who's paying for the history didn't want to be included so that they could look as good as possible. But Matthew's genealogy, he seems to go out of his way to mention those people that he should have just left out. You know, the people who he didn't need to mention. Why did he do this? Was it a mistake? Did Matthew just make a mistake? No. He meant to do it this way. In fact, as one commentator says, Matthew's genealogy was intentionally irregular. If you were trying to connect the man Jesus to the man David through the lineage of men, then why, for example, would you break protocol and start introducing the names of all these women? 4 women in particular. 2 of these women you definitely should not have mentioned if you want to prove that Jesus is like, you know, this holy Messiah. And 3 of these 4 women weren't even Jewish. So by including them, you know, Matthew doesn't, he's kind of saying, hey, the Messiah doesn't even have a pure Jewish bloodline. And that would not help his case. So, for example, let's take a look. We read here that it says that Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Now, next week, you better come next week. I don't care if it's like a 5 feet of snow. You better come next week because we are going to talk about Tamar. And I got to tell you, this is one of the spiciest and grossest, diciest stories in all the Bible. I don't know if you know the story, but once you hear it, you're never going to forget it. We're going to have to, there's parts of the story that I'm not even sure we can read out loud in church. And in fact, we're going to have to definitely make sure we dismiss the kids down to church school before we read it because it's very dicey and it's very iffy. But here is the point. There was no need to mention Tamar at all. Just stick with the guys, stick with the plan, stick with the storyline. And then he goes on. He says, Perez, the father of Hezron, Hezron, the father of Ram, Ram, the father of Amminadab, Amminadab, the father of Nahshon, Nahshon, the father of my favorite, Salmon. Or Salmon, I guess. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was, say that one with me. Right. All right, now listen. Why again are you introducing this one woman into the genealogy, and especially this one? She's not Jewish again, and in fact, this woman goes by a bit of a nickname. She's Rahab the prostitute. Woo, woo. Rahab the harlot. Why are you mentioning this? When you get to heaven and you see Rahab, you're going to walk up and you'll be like, hey, Rahab, you're the woman in the Old Testament. You're the one that Matthew mentioned in his genealogy. Why is he bringing this up? He does not need to. Keep on going. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Now, Ruth is a lovely story. Ruth is a great story. How many people here have read the book of Ruth? It's a great story. Nothing wrong with the story of Ruth, except for this. Ruth was not Jewish. And so again, if you're trying to connect Jesus, and you're trying to connect Jesus to David, that's your goal. Why all these off-ramps? Why all this sideways energy? Why all these distractions? And then we read that Obed was the father of Jesse, Jesse, the father of King David. Good. Stop right there, Matthew. You've gone far enough. You can end it right there. Good. But no, not Matthew. No, he goes on. He says, well, listen, let me go on a little bit. He says, David is the father of Solomon. And then look at how he writes this. Whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Why? Why do you have to go and mention her, right? You totally could have just left it, right? David was the father of Solomon and keep moving down the male line. But no. Matthew wants to throw in this little bit of intrigue. He doesn't even mention her by name, but of course everyone knows who he's talking about. Who was the mother of Solomon? Who had been Uriah's wife? You don't even need to be like a church person to know the story of David and Bathsheba. David slept with the wife of one of his soldiers, and when she got pregnant, he went to have that soldier killed to try to cover everything up. This was literally the worst moment of David's life, and Matthew says, yeah, I'm going to put that in. In fact, I'm going to emphasize it. I'm not even going to say Bathsheba. I'm going to focus on the fact that it was another man's wife. Why do you have to bring that up? Why not just stick with the men's names? Or you know what? Okay, fine. If you're going to mention women, then mention some of the lovely, amazing, heroic women. Where's Sarah in this list? Not there. What about Rebecca? Not there. None of them are there. There were women who did incredible things that you could honor by including them in the genealogy, but he throws in Tamar and, I know who I'm going to put, Rahab and Ruth and Solomon's mother, who was Uriah's wife. Woo! Right? So why did he do that? He did it because Matthew is trying to make a point in this whole gospel that Jesus didn't just come for sinners, he actually came from sinners. Or as one commentator puts it, the Messiah did not spring from a flawless lineage. Jesus enters the human story with all its failures so that he might redeem it from within. And I think that because Matthew spent 3 years of his life walking around and listening to Jesus and watching him and seeing him interact with people, I think that after those 3 years, he kind of got to know what Jesus was all about. And so he goes ahead and he includes all these embarrassing stories of all these kind of broken people with baggage and shady characters, because Matthew actually knows they are the point of the story that he is about to tell in his gospel. In other words, the broken branches of Jesus's family tree are not the exception. They are the point of it all. These names are not like an embarrassment that we should try to sweep under the rug and hide. These names are the gospel. By reading these names, we are proclaiming the gospel, proclaiming that God brings hope and salvation and healing both to and through broken people. And Matthew wanted to tell this story, I think, more than anybody else. And actually, Matthew was perhaps qualified to tell this story more than anybody else, because let me tell you something that Matthew knew about himself. This is what Matthew knew. Matthew knew that these people like Rahab and Tamar, or Judah, he was a bit of a tool, and then there Bathsheba and David and all these seedy characters, these were his people. These were Matthew's kind of people. Let me show you a little bit about Matthew's story to explain what I mean, and I'm going to begin with the most embarrassing moment of Matthew's entire life, and that was the moment when Matthew first met Jesus. When Matthew first met Jesus, he was sitting at a tax collector's booth and he was collecting taxes. And now, why is that so embarrassing? Why is that so outrageous? Well, let me explain to you. You see, in those days, Rome sold the rights to collect taxes to various people throughout their empire. So if you wanted a job and you wanted to collect taxes, you would go to Rome. They would say, sure, you can do it. You go collect taxes for this area, and we want you to collect this many taxes of this many kinds. And as long as Rome got what Rome asked for, Rome was happy, and tax collectors could kind of keep everything else. And that is why tax collectors were like extraordinarily rich, because they overtaxed people so that they could make money for the job that they were doing. And there were so many taxes that were out there. There were poll taxes, there were income taxes, there were bridge taxes, there were taxes on fruit, there was taxes on meat, taxes on fish, there was port taxes. Like that, everywhere you went, there was a tax in the Roman Empire. And if the Romans sent in their tax collectors to collect taxes from a people group, they actually learned something. They said that, they learned that those people didn't really like those tax collectors very much, and pretty soon they'd be keying their cars and TPing their house, and they would be like, stealing their donkeys or whatever the case may be. And so Rome came up with another idea. They said, listen, let's actually ask Jewish people to collect the taxes from the Jewish people. And so that's exactly what they did. And it was literally the worst, most embarrassing job you could ever have, was to be a Jewish person and also be a tax collector collecting taxes from your countrymen. It was betraying your nation, it was betraying your faith, it was betraying your God, it was betraying your neighbor. You were a total traitor. You were a complete outcast. Any Jewish man collecting taxes from fellow Jews was the lowest of the low. In fact, do you know in the Bible how they often put together tax collectors and sinners? Tax collectors and sinners. It's like they don't even want to put tax collectors lumped in with sinners, because tax collectors were their own low type of sinners out there. They had their own category. Now, all this means is that Matthew was one of those broken people, like we read about in the genealogy. He was one of those broken branches because he was a tax collector. And so, all those scandalous names in the family tree of Jesus, Matthew knew how they felt, because he was an embarrassment. He was ostracized. He would have been ostracized from religious life. He wouldn't have been allowed to even go to the synagogue. He would have been considered ceremonially unclean. And the only friends he would have had would have been other tax collectors and sinners. And so there Matthew is. That's his life. He's sitting in this booth. And when And then when one day, Jesus kind of comes strolling up, and he's got his disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew with him. They're walking up, and maybe they're coming up to pay taxes themselves. I mean, Capernaum was a port city. Maybe they were coming to pay a port tax or something like that. I don't know. But then Matthew sees him. Now, Matthew has probably seen or heard of Jesus before, but maybe this is the very first time he actually lays eyes on him. And as they walk up, I can imagine Jesus' disciples are probably trying to think, oh, what's the way that we should greet Matthew today? Should we sneer? Should we laugh? Should we, flip him the bird? Should we just whisper about him? What should we do? Throw dust in his face? Whatever, right? Because he's horrible, horrible, lowest of the low, the worst of the worst. Give him the side eye. Give him a mean side eye. But Jesus has another idea. Look what Jesus does. Jesus says to Matthew, follow me. To which his disciples who were with him were probably like, what did you just say, Jesus? Jesus, you can't be serious. Jesus, did we hear you correctly? You want the tax collector to follow you? And Matthew, guess what he does? He says, yeah. And he follows him. And he left that tax booth. Now, did he just leave it that day and never go back to it again? I don't know. Probably not. Probably what he did is he put one of his assistants in charge and let them take care of it for the rest of the day. And off he went. And he followed Jesus. And I can just imagine that as Matthew is writing this story in his gospel, he is just thinking and remembering those other disciples and what they were thinking and what they were saying and what they were feeling. He's just probably brought a smile to his face. And then I think this part is kind of hilarious because once Matthew starts following Jesus, his next question is probably like, so where are we going? And Jesus' answer to Matthew is, well, I was kind of thinking we could go to your place. And at this point, the other disciples must be losing their mind. They're probably like, Jesus, you have got to be joking me. It's embarrassing enough just to be seen out walking around town with this guy. And now you want us to actually go to his house and sit down at his table with him and eat with him? Are you trying to destroy this movement before it's even gotten off the ground? But Jesus says, no, Matthew, we're going to go to your house. And apparently, he must say, and invite some of your friends. Invite some of your other tax collector and sinner-like friends, and we're all going to have a meal together. And so Jesus and his disciples, they all go to Matthew's house, and all these tax collectors and sinners show up because those are the only people that would hang out with a tax collector, Matthew, and they all have this party. And of course, it's probably a pretty good party because tax collectors are kind of rich, so they probably can throw really good parties. Now, this caused quite a stir, as you can imagine, because then the religious officials that were hanging around, they see what's going on in there, and their mind is kind of blown. They don't understand. So they're waiting for one of the disciples to come out because they got some questions for this disciple. And they're like, listen, you gotta tell us what's going on here with this guy, because we hear Jesus, and there's parts of what Jesus says that we actually like, his talk about the kingdom of God. We're very intrigued by that. But then we see that he's in there. And we see that he's hanging out with them, and we are so confused. We do not understand that. Anyways, they take the message back to Jesus, and then Jesus sends out his reply. Jesus says, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but it's the sick. Now, if I was Matthew, how does this sound when I hear Jesus say it? You would think that maybe he would say, oh, you're saying I'm sick? You're saying I'm not healthy? Or his other friends could have taken great offense to what Jesus said. But apparently, they didn't. And I think it's because, do you know what people who are far from God know? They know that they are far from God. And actually, some of us here today, we know we're far from God. Now, if someone were to come along to you and say, you're spiritually sick, or you're far from God, we might take great offense, and we might, flip the bird at them or something like that because we're so upset. But when we got home, and when we cooled down, and when we thought about it, you know what? We might find ourselves saying, you know what? It's true. I am kind of far from God. Spiritually speaking, I know it's a metaphor, spiritually speaking, I am sick and I am in need of help. That is apparently how how Matthew received these words and how Matthew's friends received these words. And then Jesus actually took it another step further, and he adds, "For I've come not to call the righteous, but sinners," right? That word, sinners. Even that, though, didn't appear to be offensive to Matthew and his friends, because again, they knew. They knew. Yeah, that kind of sums it up. He knew that he was one of those broken branches, one of those sick people, one of those sinners. And what Jesus was saying was actually true. But Matthew would later come to know and understand that this is exactly why Jesus came. Jesus came for those who knew that they were sick, not for those who thought they were healthy. As one commentator would put it, the distinction Jesus draws here is not between righteous people on the one hand and unrighteous people on the other hand, but between those who admit their need and those who deny it. And it seems really odd, but actually, those who are so confident in their own righteousness and those who say, "I don't need anything," are the ones who actually exclude themselves from the healing that Jesus can offer them. So, the question is, what does any of this have to do with Christmas? Well, according to Matthew, it has everything to do with Christmas, because Matthew would go on from that moment and he would spend years following Jesus, listening to Jesus. He would see Jesus, his popularity rising and falling. He would see Jesus get arrested and executed. He would see the empty tomb. He would encounter the risen Jesus after all of this. And he says, after all that, he says, "I got to sit down and I got to write this story out." And so he goes and he quickly, he starts writing this out, and he says, and the way I'm going to start this, because I know what I'm going to say, he says, the way I'm going to start this, before I get to the angels and before I get to the innkeepers of the shepherds, I want to begin with a genealogy that is full of sinners and misfits and broken people, because that is the point of this story. That was the point of Jesus, and that is the point of Christmas. This is why Jesus came. He did not come for the healthy. He came for the sick. And Matthew understood that maybe better than any of the other gospel writers. And he understood what the story of Christmas was all about. The story of Christmas is the story of Jesus drawing near to those who had drawn away from him. It's the story of God moving in toward those who had moved away from him. Or years later, Karl Barth would say, the incarnation or Christmas is God's decisive movement towards us, not our movement toward him. It is God drawing near to the far off. And Matthew highlights all of those problems and all those misfits in the genealogy because those people reflected why Jesus came in the first place. Matthew and his friends thought much the same as many of us think. We think that in order to approach God, you have to approach God based on what you do or what you haven't done. You have to do good things and you have to avoid doing bad things. And if you do good things and avoid doing bad things, then God will accept you. But if that's how it works, then Matthew had no way to God. And I have no way to God. And frankly, you have no way to God either. But thanks be to God, that is not how it works. And Matthew picked up in his time with Jesus and walking with Jesus and learning from Jesus. He came to understand that the rules have changed and that he as a tax collector, he as a sinner, he as an outsider, he as someone who has failed in every way possible, he could actually approach God. But it was not going to be on the basis of anything he had done. It was going to be because of what Jesus had done for him. Those sinners in that genealogy, that's the point. God did not come for people who can stand on their own righteousness, but he came for those who stand on what Jesus has done on their behalf. And I bet that I can picture him, Matthew writing that genealogy. He was probably laughing. He was probably giggling and chuckling and smiling as he says, oh, you know what? I'm going to mention Tamar by name. I'm going to mention her. And I'm going to allude to Judah's screw-ups. And I'm going to even mention, David's big sin and Bathsheba. I'm not going to mention Bathsheba by name, but I'm going to call her, the Uriah's wife, the one who was Uriah's wife. And I'm going to mention Rahab, the prostitute, and Manasseh, the worst king that we ever had. I'm going to include them, he said, because they're the point. They're the point of the story I'm going to tell. They're the point of Christmas. And just to wrap up, when Matthew finally gets through this genealogy and he finally gets down to telling us about Mary and Joseph and stuff like that, do you know what the first words on the mouth of the angel are? The first words are, Mary will give birth to a son, and you're going to call him Jesus. Why? Because he will save his people from their sins. That's what the name Jesus means. That's the point of Christmas. Jesus came to save his people. Matthew knew all about that. And so for the next week, next 2 weeks, next 3 weeks, we're going to approach Christmas the very same way. We're going to take a look at some of those broken branches, those shady characters in Jesus' family tree. And although sitting here this morning, you might not see it, but I'll tell you, in that long list of broken, messy names, God is preaching a gospel to us that we don't need a helper. We don't need an example to follow. We don't need a life coach. What we need is a Savior, and the good news is that Jesus came to save broken branches like me, like you, like Matthew and the rest of us. So thanks be to God. Amen.